Today's presentation on invisible disabilities in the workplace begins with an overview of what an invisible disability is, along with a description of a few conditions that are not apparent to illustrate the variety of types of disabilities that are invisible. And then we will focus on best practices for navigating Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is referred to as the ADA, through the lens of an invisible disability. So first, I'd like to introduce myself and the colleagues I am presenting with today. I'm Julie Wood, Accessible Ohio Manager at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. I am also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I am leading the efforts of the Accessible Ohio Initiative and the Accessible Ohio team, which is aimed at partnering with employers, businesses, communities, venues, and attractions to be accessible and inclusive for all individuals, including individuals with disabilities. I am happy to be presenting today with two of our four Accessible Ohio specialists, Shelley and Julia. Shelley, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Julie. Hello, my name is Shelley Burkhart, and I'm the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Northwest area of the state. I most recently served as a vocational rehabilitation counselor with OOD. Julia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Shelley. Hello, my name is Julia Wagner, and I'm also an Accessible Ohio Specialist and an occupational therapist. I serve the Southwest area of the state. Julie, before we begin, would you like to address the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text known as alt text to visual images. Also, in our delivery, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. And with that, let's get started. When we hear the term disability, we often think of apparent disabilities, like a person who has a physical disability and uses a wheelchair, or a person who is blind and uses a cane. Shelley, are most disabilities apparent?
Actually, Julie, more than half of all disabilities are not apparent and are referred to as invisible. I will share more on this in a little while, but first I'd like to start by asking our webinar attendees a polling question pertaining to this.
That's a great idea, Shelley. Let's hear the question.
The first question for our audience is, what percentage of employees with a disability have an invisible disability? The choices are 12%, 30%, 47%, 62%, or 85%. We have all sorts of answers coming in, so we'll wait until those seem to slow down. It looks like the majority of our audience thought that the answer was 62%. The correct answer is actually 62%. A study from the Center for Talent Innovation revealed 62% of all employees with a disability have an invisible disability. An invisible disability is a condition where the disability, symptoms, and limitations are not apparent. This can include a variety of types of conditions ranging from physical to mental health, intellectual, sensory, or neurological in nature. So it's not just one kind of condition. For example, Julie, it may not be apparent when a person has a traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, bipolar disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or is hard of hearing.
Shelley, this information supports the importance of having a better understanding of invisible disabilities. Not only is there a range of disabilities included in this category, but there's also a range of limitations and abilities too, right, Julia?
Correct. All disabilities, whether they're apparent or invisible, have a range of symptoms, limitations, abilities, and severity levels. And that's important to remember in the workplace, so we understand that two employees with the same disability will each experience the condition in their own way. As an employer, it's best to focus on how a disability-related limitation impacts work performance or accessing the environment. Understanding some of the characteristics of invisible disabilities can be helpful for an employer when an employee requests a reasonable accommodation to access the environment or perform the job.
Thank you, Julia. Let's ask our audience another polling question.
Sure, Julie, I'd be happy to ask one. An employee may need more than one type of accommodation. True or false? Like we're getting a lot of responses. Thank you, everyone. I would say it's almost unanimous for true. So it looks like the majority of our audience thought it was true, and the correct answer is true. There are times an employee may need more than one type of accommodation.
Thank you, Julia. We are going to address when this could be the case as we talk about examples of conditions that are invisible. In these examples, we will also share information that may be helpful to employers when they are providing accommodations. Shelley, let's begin with our first condition.
Sounds good. The first condition we'll discuss is a traumatic brain injury, which is referred to as a TBI. A TBI can result from a sudden, forceful assault to the head. A unique characteristic of a TBI is that it can impact a variety of functions in the body, including thought, movement, sensory processing, communication and language, moods and emotions, and more. For example, a TBI may impact a person's attention span, memory, and problem-solving abilities, or it could impact balance and coordination.
Shelley, if a variety of functions in the body can be impacted, there are probably important considerations when thinking about appropriate, reasonable accommodations. What can this mean for an employer when they are considering reasonable accommodations related to traumatic brain injuries?
Well, Julie, just like the result of our true or false question revealed, an employee may need more than one type of accommodation based on the way the TBI impacted them. For example, maybe an employee is experiencing limitations with memory and requests an accommodation, such as being able to record meetings or being provided a transcript afterwards to reference. The same employee may also be experiencing limitations with fine motor coordination and is having difficulty entering information into the computer using a keyboard and mouse. An accommodation that could be considered is speech recognition software that can be used to dictate information just as effectively.
So, Shelley, in other words, it's important to know that when an employee with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation, they may or may not need more than one. I think that is definitely something valuable to keep in mind. Could you provide another example, Julia?
Sure. The next condition we'd like to talk about is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, known as ADHD. This condition is characterized by an ongoing pattern of symptoms that involves inattention, hyperactivity, and/or impulsivity. Inattention can impact the workplace by limiting the person's ability to focus, stay organized, and stay on task. Hyperactivity can cause a person to fidget, move about, or talk excessively, and impulsivity can cause a person to interrupt others. Julie, people with ADHD may treat this condition with medications, therapy, or both.
Julia, what could be the implications for a reasonable accommodation when considering the symptoms associated with ADHD?
This could be another time an employee with an invisible disability needs more than one accommodation. For example, the employee may need a flexible schedule to attend therapy sessions once a week for a period of time, or modified breaks to manage medication needs, which could include accessing food and drink to take with medications. Julie, I'd like to point out that while two types of accommodations may be needed, both of these accommodations seem relatively simple to implement and can be provided at no cost.
That's a great point. Another condition that can be invisible to others is being hard of hearing. Shelley, could you provide more information on this example?
I'd be happy to. Hard of hearing generally refers to hearing loss that ranges from mild to severe. People who are hard of hearing often communicate through spoken language and may use assistive technology and services such as hearing aids, cochlear implants, assistive listening devices, and/or captioning. Being hard of hearing can manifest in a variety of ways. There's also a diversity among individuals relating to how they became hard of hearing, their level of hearing, and the age of onset of hearing loss. What this means when an employer is providing reasonable accommodation is each employee will be affected differently by their disability, which reminds us that each request for a reasonable accommodation should be approached on a case-by-case basis, because what each employee needs will be unique.
Shelley, that's a helpful reminder. Thank you. Now, we know that employees with disabilities often do not need reasonable accommodations, but when they do, there are times when what is needed may change. Julia, do you have an example that illustrates this?
I do. Multiple sclerosis, which is referred to as MS, is a condition that impacts the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. MS can result in neurological symptoms like fatigue, weakness, and decreased endurance. One unique characteristic of MS is that it can be progressive and worsen over time, which means the need for reasonable accommodation may change. What this means when an employer is providing a reasonable accommodation is an employee may not need an accommodation until the condition worsens, or an employee may need one kind of accommodation initially, and as the condition progresses, may need an additional or a different accommodation. For example, an employee who is diagnosed with MS may not need a reasonable accommodation at work initially. Over time, though, the employee begins to experience fatigue and requests a flexible schedule to work when her energy is most optimal. Later, when her condition limits her endurance for walking, she utilizes a wheelchair and requests to have a designated accessible parking space at work. So, Julie, it's important to know that an employee with a disability may not need an accommodation at all, and the need for an accommodation may change if a condition changes.
And Julia, this example demonstrates another time when an employee may need more than one accommodation, both of which seem fairly simple to implement. Okay, the last condition we are going to highlight is bipolar disorder, which is characterized by a dramatic shift in mood, energy, and the ability to think clearly. There are 4 types of bipolar disorder. We aren't going to discuss the individual types, but from a general perspective, bipolar disorder presents as a shift between high and low moods and may include periods of normal mood. What this means when an employer is providing a reasonable accommodation is an accommodation may be needed at certain times and not others. Or one accommodation may be needed during periods of a high mood and a different accommodation may be needed during periods of a low mood. So the effective accommodation may change depending on what the individual is experiencing. Hopefully, the examples we shared emphasize the importance of an employer looking at each situation on a case-by-case basis when considering reasonable accommodations. So now let's talk about disclosure. When an employee has an invisible disability, it's unknown to others unless the employee chooses to disclose. That choice is a personal one and is always the decision of the employee. Shelley, are there reasons someone may choose to disclose or not to disclose to their employer?
There are. As you've noted, this is a personal choice and can be a difficult one for the employee to make. Let's start with reasons an employee may choose not to disclose their disability. These may include the employee having a fear of being viewed negatively, or of being questioned about whether the condition is real, or even of being accused of trying to obtain special privileges. However, there are common reasons an employee may choose to disclose their disability to an employer. For instance, one main reason the employee may choose to disclose is to receive protection under the ADA for a reasonable accommodation at work. A person may also choose to disclose to relieve the stress associated with not disclosing and to develop a support system. Julie, disclosing can result in an employee feeling comfortable bringing their whole self to work.
It sounds like each person will have his or her own reasons when it comes to disclosing or not disclosing their disability. It really is important to remember this is a personal choice and always the decision of the employee. And individuals can disclose at any point during the hiring process or employment, which makes sense since employees with disabilities do not always need an accommodation until something changes or progresses with their disability. Okay, we're going to stop for our first break for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat or raise your virtual hand. Also, while we're waiting for questions, we did receive some pre-submitted questions during the registration process for today's webinar. So Julia, while we're waiting, do you want to start with a pre-submitted question?
Thanks, Julie. The first one is, are employers allowed or supposed to ask employees or interviewees what their disability is?
Thank you for that question. The ADA Title I, which is the employment title, is regulated and enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is known as the EEOC. They provide a lot of really great guidance for employers in navigating their responsibilities under Title I. They have two different guidances, one for the pre-employment process, which is hiring, and one for employment that addresses specifically disability-related questions. So those guidances will define what a disability-related question is and when they can and cannot be asked and how they can be asked. So for example, in the hiring process, you are not permitted to ask disability-related questions in the pre-offer phase, which are things like the application and interview before you make a formal offer for a job. During the hiring phase, after a formal offer is extended, then employers can ask disability-related questions as long as those are applied to all candidates applying for that job and receiving a job offer in that same job category. Once a candidate becomes an employee, then employers generally are no longer permitted to ask disability-related questions unless it's job-related and consistent with business necessity, and they've got specific criteria that addresses that. For example, if you're addressing direct threat of safety, or if you're in the interactive process looking at reasonable accommodations. So that's a great question. There is specific guidance to address that in the different phases. We'd be happy to connect you with that guidance if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Julie. It looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. The first one was, what could some reasonable accommodations be for employees with anxiety? And it looks like there was a response pointing to Ask Jan, which I know that we've mentioned, but just wanted to include that question.
Sure. So from a general perspective, just some ideas that could be considered. Again, you would have dialogue with the individual making the request for the accommodation to see what specifically would help with what they are experiencing as a barrier in the workplace. But some ideas might be a flexible schedule. Maybe the person is seeking treatment for this condition and they need to adjust their work schedule for a period of time to be able to make it to appointments. So maybe permitting them to leave one day a week early and make that time up on another day. Could be a flexible schedule in the form of modifying breaks. So the person has time to step away from work tasks, maybe go to a private space and do some breathing exercises, some stress relieving exercises that help to manage anxiety. Another idea might be to modify a workplace policy if the person needs to take medication at work and needs food and drink to do that. Sometimes an employer will modify a policy that says you cannot have food and drink at the workstation. So that can be permitted during the times the person needs to take medication. So those are some quick ideas.
Great, thank you. We have another question. If you manage an employee that you suspect might have a disability and benefit from accommodation, but they have not disclosed any disability, are there ways of encouraging them to get support without suggesting they may have a disability or make them feel pressured to disclose anything?
That is a fantastic question. And so what I would say is there must be something that is making you think that A, they have a disability, and B, they could use an accommodation that would be helpful. And usually that is either job performance or conduct. So we all have expectations in the jobs that we have. And so if you're seeing low performance and you think the reason might be related to a disability, you want to check that guidance about when you can ask disability related questions. And so the best practice we share is to focus your questions on those job duties and where you're seeing the low performance. Rely on that objective information and have a conversation. For example, I'm noticing, and then you insert whatever the low performance is and ask, how can I help? That simple question, and then pausing and waiting to hear their answer. In their answer, they may disclose something related to a medical condition or a disability and a barrier in the workplace. It can be very subtle, but if you receive that, that's a request for an accommodation, and you could then kind of hand that off to HR to begin the interactive process, just to support the employee in understanding what their options are if they want to make a request for an accommodation. So I would rely on your objective information, have your conversation about the job and what you're noticing in low performance, and simply ask how you can help, and then listen to that response. And if you hear a request for an accommodation, then hand that off to your HR team to take it from there.
Thanks, Julie. Another question is, for genetic disabilities, visible or invisible, are there guidelines for renewal of accommodations? After the initial request with doctor documentation, is it required to provide, provide this documentation again?
So when you engage in the interactive process, there are times that you are permitted to obtain documentation, and that is when the disability is invisible or the need for the accommodation is invisible. So if you've obtained that documentation and that documentation suggests that the condition is long-term, lifelong, there wouldn't generally be a reason to need that documentation again for that disability. If a person would make a request for an accommodation that doesn't pertain to that disability, you might be able to go back to get documentation. But once you have it established that a person has a disability, then you wouldn't continually renew your documentation for that from a general perspective. And there is guidance from the EEOC that we can share to support you in making your decision about moving forward with that.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions, but based on timing, is that something that we would address later on?
We can try to catch those later. I think we have one more pre-submitted one we want to make sure to fit in right now.
All right, thank you. That pre-submitted question is, employers never think of mental health disabilities. So how do you make them aware when this information is confidential?
So another great question, just some best practices that we promote. First is education. So we provide monthly webinars to an employer audience on a variety of best practices for providing accommodations, making the work environment accessible, and we address all disability types when we do that. We have helpful resources on the website to connect with employers, and we do customized consultations with employer partners when they have specific questions about their work environment. If you're trying to make internal efforts with a specific disability-related topic, sometimes employers have success when they've established an employee resource group, commonly known as an ERG, that has a focus on disability. That group of individuals that come together can sometimes identify barriers in the workplace, ideas for ways to make the environment more accessible, and can also host educational type sessions or events on specific disability topics like mental health. That can be accompanied by any resources the employer may have for their employees to support their mental health. So education and internal efforts, maybe through a group like an ERG, could be helpful ideas.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all those great questions. We will try to get to the additional ones in the chat at the next break, along with some more pre-submitted questions. But now we're going to continue with the content. So we mentioned earlier, an invisible disability often includes symptoms and limitations that are not obvious. Julia, can you provide some examples of these?
Sure. An individual with an invisible disability may experience some of these symptoms, but would rarely experience them all. These can include increased pain and fatigue, decreased strength and endurance, difficulty with memory, concentrating, and prioritizing tasks, and difficulty hearing conversations or information shared in audio formats. When these symptoms impact an employee at work, they can result in limitations with performing job tasks. Examples of these can include decreased productivity or missing deadlines, having a difficult time managing daily work tasks, making mistakes that impact the quality of work, and missing important information during meetings and events like training presentations.
Thanks, Julia. Shelley, do employees with invisible disabilities always experience disability-related limitations at work?
No, an employee with any disability, whether it's apparent or invisible, may not necessarily experience limitations or barriers at work related to their disability. Or they may not experience these until something with the condition changes or a barrier presents itself in the workplace. For example, an employee may have trouble focusing or hearing when their workstation is moved to a noisy area, or the employee experiences limitations with handling new tasks, like being given the responsibility of training a new employee, or the employee may be late for work due to increased fatigue from a change in medication. So Julie, this may lead an employee who did not need an accommodation before to request one when something changes and they experience a barrier in the workplace.
That's a great reminder that an employee with a disability may not need a reasonable accommodation until something changes, and that could be a change with their disability or a change in the workplace. We've been using the term reasonable accommodation frequently in our presentation, so Julia, it may be helpful to review what a reasonable accommodation is.
Good idea. Basically, a reasonable accommodation is a change in the workplace that enables an employee with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job or access the work environment in another way just as effectively. Each employee, employer, and workplace are unique. And so, as we've mentioned, a request for a reasonable accommodation should be considered on a case-by-case basis to identify the effective solution. Employers who are covered under Title I of the ADA are required to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so causes an undue hardship. When we discuss reasonable accommodations, there's a common misconception that accommodations are costly or difficult to implement, which leads to the next question for our audience. What do you think is the typical cost of a reasonable accommodation? Please enter your answers in the chat.
So Julia, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat and see what guesses we have from the audience on what they think is the typical cost of a reasonable accommodation. So they're starting to come in. I'm seeing 0, 500, less than 100, less than 500, 200, 600, free, 2,500, less than 1,000. Keep coming in. Very minimal, less than 100. These are great guesses. 300. Percent of profit on the business, but minimal. Okay, we're going to reveal the answer. Thank you for your participation. These are some great answers. So Julia, could you tell us what the correct answer is?
Sure, I'd be happy to. A study from the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, revealed nearly half of reasonable accommodations cost nothing at all. And those with a one-time cost typically cost $300.
These statistics support that reasonable accommodations are often affordable. Although nearly half of all reasonable accommodations are free, we know some accommodations come with a cost. Shelley, providing a reasonable accommodation can positively impact the workplace for both the employee and the employer. Can you tell us more about the benefit to the employer?
Of course. The Northwest ADA Center has a resource on their website called the Small Business at Work Toolkit, which includes studies that show employees with disabilities have higher performance ratings, are absent less, and stay on the job longer than employees without disabilities. So, Julie, these results demonstrate that employing qualified individuals with disabilities and providing a reasonable accommodation when one is needed is a good investment by an employer.
Shelley, thank you for sharing those positive outcomes. Julia, some employers have asked about ways to afford accommodations that come with a cost. Can you provide some best practices to help them?
Sure. One best practice is for an employer to create a budget or a centralized accommodation fund specifically for workplace accommodations. This can alleviate the concerns some hiring managers and supervisors have that the cost of accommodations need to come from their department's operating budget. It also helps to streamline the process for purchasing and implementing accommodations, making it more efficient. Another idea is for the employer to talk with their tax professionals about the tax incentives available to employers who employ individuals with disabilities, provide reasonable accommodations, and make changes to create an accessible workplace. There are three main tax incentives employers may wish to explore. Shelley, would you help me explain these?
Sure. The first is the Disabled Access Credit. This is a credit for small businesses that incur costs associated with removing barriers and creating environments accessible to individuals with disabilities. This credit can be taken each year. There are expenses, Julia.
The second is the barrier removal tax deduction, which applies to businesses of any size. This is a deduction for the removal of architectural and transportation barriers related to the mobility of individuals with disabilities. The deduction is a maximum of $15,000 a year for qualified expenses that customarily are capitalized. Shelley, what's the final tax incentive we have to share?
The third incentive is the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. This credit is available to employers who hire individuals from specific groups who have faced significant barriers to employment. This includes qualified individuals with disabilities served through vocational rehabilitation programs provided by agencies like OOD. It can be very helpful for an employer to be aware of these tax incentives, Julie.
I agree. Some employers choose to allocate the funds obtained through these incentives toward their accommodation budgets and their disability inclusion efforts in the workplace. Those efforts can include creating a formal process for navigating the interactive process and providing reasonable accommodations. We know a formal process is not required under the ADA, but it is a best practice that many employers find helpful. With that said, a common question employers have is, what is different about navigating the interactive process when an employee who requests an accommodation has an invisible disability? Julia, is the process the same or different?
Well, the answer is that generally the process is the same. One area that differs, though, is with obtaining documentation. I'd like to ask our webinar audience a polling question. According to the EEOC, which of the following are times when an employer is permitted to request documentation from their employee when they request a reasonable accommodation? To verify a disability exists, to describe the disability-related limitation impacted in the workplace, to substantiate the need for a reasonable accommodation, or all the above. Julie, what are the results?
Well, Julia, they're still coming in. We have a majority, but I want to see if it's going to stay that way. Looks like the audience is landing on the majority, thinking the answer is all of the above. What is the correct answer, Julia?
The correct answer is all the above. According to the guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as the EEOC, When the disability or the need for an accommodation is not obvious, employers are permitted to ask for reasonable documentation, which means you can request documentation to verify the disability exists, understand the limitation related to the disability that is affected at work, and identify the need for a reasonable accommodation. Now, while an employer is permitted to obtain documentation, they are not required to, Julie.
Okay, so once an employer has received a request and has determined whether to obtain documentation, Shelley, what is the next step in the process?
The next step is to identify options. To do this, the employer continues the informal collaboration described in the ADA as the interactive process. This includes the employer and the employee working together to clarify what the employee needs and identify an effective solution. And remember, each request for an accommodation should be considered on a case-by-case basis because each person, each job, and each employer is unique. As we've discussed, it's also important to remember that the need for an accommodation may change over time, so the interactive process may need to be revisited. Julie, where's the best place to start to identify a solution?
The best place to start is to ask the employee what ideas they have about what might be helpful. The employee may have experienced this barrier in another setting and already knows what will work best. Now, when you are identifying options, it can be helpful to know the types of reasonable accommodations that are available. Julia, could you share these with us?
Sure. The EEOC organizes reasonable accommodations into these types: making the environment accessible, modifying policies, restructuring the job, permitting leave, permitting a flexible schedule, altering supervisory methods, and providing equipment and services. This list really helps to highlight the variety of options for accommodations. Shelley, let's share some examples that fit in a few of these categories.
I think that would be helpful. Our first example is to make the environment accessible as a form of reasonable accommodation. This could include the employer relocating an employee's office away from a noisy environment to a private office with less distraction.
Shelley, another example could be modifying a no food policy to permit an employee to have food and drink at the workstation so the employee can take medication as needed.
And Julia, the employer may also consider providing a flexible schedule as a reasonable accommodation so an employee can take a break as needed to manage symptoms, like taking a break to go to a private space to perform breathing exercises to decrease anxiety.
Thank you both for sharing some examples of the types of reasonable accommodations employers can consider. Now, there may be times during the interactive process when neither the employer nor the employee is able to identify an effective accommodation. And so it can be helpful to be familiar with external resources that can help. We have several ideas to share. Julia, do you want to start us off?
Well, one option with the employee's permission is to contact the employee's medical provider and ask what recommendations they have, or ask if they could comment on a specific accommodation that is being considered. Shelley, what's another idea?
Another idea is using services from our agency, OOD. OOD provides vocational rehabilitation services to Ohioans with disabilities who encounter a disability-related barrier to finding or keeping a job. During the interactive process, an employer could mention our services to the employee, and if the employee wishes to seek services, he or she can visit our website at www.oodworks.com. These services are voluntary and confidential, so the employer cannot apply for an individual or inquire about whether they are receiving services. Certainly, the employee does not have to seek services with OOD, but it can be helpful to inform him so he knows these services are an option. Julia, what other external resources are an option for employers?
Employer partners are also welcome to contact their business relations specialist at OOD to schedule a workplace accessibility consult. A consult includes talking with an Accessible Ohio specialist for general ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations, and to address questions that arise when navigating the interactive process. To further support employers, OOD also offers a variety of resources, fact sheets, and on-demand webinars to support their efforts. These are organized by topic and available through our Inclusive Employer Toolkit on the Employers page of the OOD website. What's our next idea, Shelley?
Another great external resource is the lending libraries in Ohio, where someone can borrow technology-related items and use them in the workplace to determine if they are an effective, reasonable accommodation solution. Two of these libraries include the Assistive Technology, or AT Ohio, housed at the Ohio State University, and OCALI, which is the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence. Julia, what else?
Two final resources we'll share include the ADA National Network and JAN, which again is the Job Accommodation Network. They both provide information on accommodations and disability employment topics and are available to employees and employers who contact them with questions. The ADA National Network is divided into regional ADA centers, and Ohio belongs to the Great Lakes ADA Center. JAN has two helpful resources employers can use to search for reasonable accommodation ideas. The first is the searchable online accommodation resource known as SOAR, where the user can enter a search phrase and then be connected with accommodation options. The other is JAN's A to Z list, which organizes topics by disability, limitation, work-related function, topic, and accommodation. So, Julie, these resources can be a helpful support to employers during the interactive process when neither the employer nor the employee is able to identify an effective solution and could benefit from suggestions and ideas.
I agree. Thank you both for sharing so many great resources to consider. Another common topic we address with employers is performance. Before we discuss this topic, I'd like to ask our attendees a true or false question. Employees who have disclosed a disability are not held to the organization's job performance expectations and consequences for low performance. True or false? Shelley, what do our attendees think?
We're getting lots of good responses, Julie. It looks like the majority of our respondents think that the answer is false. What is the correct answer, Julie?
The correct answer for this question is false. Employees with disabilities are held to the organization's expectations for job performance and consequences for low performance, just as all employees are. So let's talk about this in more detail. Employers have shared that sometimes during a low performance review, an employee will disclose a disability and indicate the disability is contributing to their low performance. This disclosure may or may not include a request for a reasonable accommodation. And so, Shelley, what should employers do in this case?
First, be aware that at times an employee's low performance may be their first indicator to themselves that their disability is impacting performance. Julie, it's also helpful to know the ADA does not prohibit employers from creating productivity expectations, administering performance evaluations, or even establishing consequences for low performance.
And that's because to receive protection under Title I of the ADA, an individual with a disability must be qualified, which means the person is able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. So, Shelley, how do employers navigate this?
When the employee discloses a disability and says that her disability is affecting performance, the employer proceeds in two ways. First, the employer clearly communicates the job's performance expectations and any consequences that apply to all employees with low performance in the same job. And second, the employer addresses the disclosure of disability. How the employer addresses this will be unique to each workplace, so it's important to know what steps to take next. So Julia, what are these next steps?
Well, one organization may permit their supervisors and managers to ask the employee how they can help or in what way the disability is contributing to the low performance. Other organizations may want this conversation referred to someone in human resources or HR to continue the conversation once a disability has been disclosed. If a supervisor or manager is permitted to ask the employee what they can do to help, and the employee indicates a change at work that would help or would like to explore options, then the interactive process needs to begin so this can be discussed further. This should be done in a timely manner and customarily involves the manager referring the employee to the appropriate contact person in HR. If the employee indicates he does not wish to pursue options, it's best to inform him of who to contact if he changes his mind and wants to discuss this further at another time. It's important to remember that according to the guidance from the EEOC, when an employee with a disability has low performance and requests a reasonable accommodation, one must be considered. Julie, I imagine employers have questions about applying the consequences for low performance when an employee discloses a disability and attributes their low performance to their disability.
You are correct. Employers often ask if they are permitted to apply their consequences for low performance when disability is a factor. Shelley, what can you tell us about this?
It's worth mentioning again that the ADA does not prohibit employers from establishing consequences for low performance, and employers are permitted to apply these consequences to all employees, including employees with disabilities with low performance. However, once a disability is disclosed and an accommodation is requested, it's important to also begin the interactive process as we previously discussed. Julie, at times, the best practice is to wait to apply the consequences for low performance until the reasonable accommodation can be implemented so the employee has an equal opportunity to improve their performance using that reasonable accommodation.
That makes sense and is likely a good idea when you think about consequences like a performance improvement plan. Having the accommodation in place helps to set the person up for success because the point of a reasonable accommodation is to enable an employee with a disability to perform the job's essential functions effectively. So let's go back to the interactive process now. Navigating this process results in the employer receiving sensitive information about the employee. This can occur through collecting documentation when permitted and through conversations with the employee. Julia, what kind of guidance is there for employers on how to handle this sensitive information?
All the medical and personal information an employer obtains through the disclosure of a disability and navigating the interactive process, as you noted, is very sensitive information. It must be kept confidential. The EEOC provides criteria for this that include storing and maintaining information on separate forms and in separate files that are kept apart from other personnel files. There are some exceptions that permit certain information to be shared. For example, a supervisor is permitted to know when a policy has been modified as a form of reasonable accommodation to permit an employee to have food and drink at the workstation, but is not permitted to know it's because the employee has diabetes and needs to take medication with food and drink. Julie, there are other things to consider when it comes to confidentiality.
You're right, and that includes how to address the questions that coworkers have about the accommodations they notice their colleagues receiving. Sometimes a disability may be invisible, but the accommodation is not, and that leads to questions. Shelley, how should employers handle the questions they receive from employees about a coworker's accommodations?
At times, other employees question the accommodations they notice in the workplace. When this happens, it's important to continue to be aware of confidentiality. When considering this, the employer may want to think about how they prefer supervisors and staff who implement accommodations respond to employees who have questions about the coworker's accommodation. When the disability is invisible, the need for the accommodation is not obvious, but as you mentioned, the accommodation itself is likely not invisible. So an employee may ask about why a coworker is receiving special treatment, like having a flexible schedule. Let me first share how not to respond to such inquiries. You do not want to say that an employee has a disability. And you also do not want to reveal the employee is receiving a reasonable accommodation, because this term is unique to the ADA and automatically discloses the employee has a disability, which we know is prohibited. Julia, what ideas do you have for how employers could respond?
There are best practices, so I will share some of these. A best practice is for an employer to consult with its legal professionals and its HR team to craft a response for these questions. One idea to consider is a response that states these matters are personal and confidential and advise the employee their privacy would be respected similarly. If the employee continues with questions, it's best for the employer to ask if there is something they need, listen to their response, and know when to refer them to HR to continue the conversation. One best practice that may prevent or minimize receiving these types of questions is for the employer to provide education for new employees at onboarding and for all employees on a regular basis about the laws they're required to follow, such as the Family and Medical Leave Act, workers' compensation laws, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. This may increase employee awareness of the confidential situations occurring in the workplace and lead to fewer questions about coworkers' accommodations. I hope these best practices are helpful to employers, Julie.
Thank you for sharing them. Now, there may also be a concern of coworkers approaching one another or the employee with a disability about an accommodation they have observed. Shelley, are there any suggestions for the employer for this situation?
There are. While an employer cannot disclose an employee's disability, the employee may choose to disclose with their coworkers. When the employer and the employee are in the interactive process, it may be beneficial to address disclosure with the employee. This encourages the employee to think about how they feel about disclosure and decide whether they want coworkers to know about the disability or the accommodation before any questions are asked. Again, the disability may be invisible, but the accommodation may not be. It is possible that employees may get questions from their coworkers. Talking about this during the interactive process could help the employee decide how they want to respond. During this conversation, it's important the employer reminds the employee that disclosure is not required and is a personal choice. Julia, what's another aspect of communication about disability employers might want to be aware of?
Another type of communication that can occur when a reasonable accommodation is implemented is coworkers talking about the employee with a disability, which then has the potential to lead to gossip or harassment. One way to prevent this is to provide general education on proper communications in the workplace for all employees and address any anti-harassment and retaliation policies you may have. If employers are educating their employees about proper communications in the workplace, are there other types of training that could help employers foster a more inclusive environment, Shelley?
There are, Julia. It's also a best practice for an employer to educate its staff in general about disability. One of the best ways we at OOD can support these efforts is through our no-cost disability awareness and etiquette training. That includes information about disabilities and interacting with employees with disabilities. It's geared toward making everyone feel more comfortable and included. Julie, what will you share how employers can access this type of training?
Sure. Like Shelley mentioned, OOD can help support employers through no-cost disability awareness and etiquette training. Employers can certainly contact the business relations specialist in their region for more information, or visit the employers page of the OOD website, which provides an overview of the training that we offer, along with a 30-minute and 60-minute on-demand option for training. Customarily, we would stop now for our second question and answers break, but we are at the 11 o'clock hour. I think what I'm going to suggest is that we conclude the webinar and then we stick around for a few minutes to answer the rest of the questions. If anyone needs to leave, we want to respect your time, but know that the questions that we address are certainly going to be a part of the recording that lives in the archive that we will post in our on-demand library. So let's just move to conclude now, and then we'll stick around to answer questions. So with that, before we close, Shelley, do you have some final thoughts to share?
I do. As we discussed, disabilities are often invisible and unknown unless an employee chooses to disclose. We also know disclosure is a personal choice and is always the decision of the employee. Julia?
One reason an employee may choose to disclose is to request a reasonable accommodation. When an accommodation is needed, the effective solution must be identified on a case-by-case basis through a collaborative effort between the employee and the employer, known as the interactive process, to help the employee meet performance expectations. There are many resources available to help identify a reasonable accommodation, including contacting us here at OOD. Julie?
I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and for your continued interest in our webinars and for your great participation and questions. We certainly enjoyed sharing today's information with you. Thank you to Shelley and Julia. It's been a pleasure to present with you today, and I appreciate the team behind the scenes who work hard to make sure these webinars are a success.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you all for joining us. Please remember to submit the training evaluation to receive HRCI or SHRM credit or for verification of attendance for today's training. If you do not need these credits, we still invite you to complete the evaluation because this will help us to continually improve the information we provide for employers through these webinars. We will be posting a recording of today's presentation and we'll forward that link to you at a later time. And I'd also like to announce our next webinar. It's titled Lessons in Accessibility and will be on November 16th. OOD's Accessible Ohio Manager, Julie Wood, and Accessible Ohio Specialist, Tanya Vella and Brianna Potter will present information and best practices to help employers recognize ways to meet and exceed their responsibilities under Title I of the ADA. So please be on the lookout for that announcement. We'd love to have you join us again. Thank you and see you in November.
Thank you, Shelley. So Julia, do you want to start with the final two pre-submitted questions, and then we can scan back through the chat to address any that we may have missed in that first break or new ones that came in?
Absolutely. So one of the pre-submitted questions was, what kinds of proactive measures should managers take to support their team?
Great. So I love questions that address managers and supervisors because they have such a significant role in supporting an employer's responsibilities under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we shared some examples today that it's helpful for supervisors to plan for how they're going to respond to those questions they receive about a coworker's accommodations. Also, we've created a webinar called the Supervisor's Responsibilities with Navigating Title I of the ADA. And in that, we talk about how it's important to train them to recognize a request for an accommodation, know who to hand that conversation off to in human resources to enter into the interactive process. It's helpful for supervisors and managers to know examples of types of accommodations and to know that jobs can be performed in another way through an accommodation. And then often supervisors have a role in supporting the implementation of an accommodation. For example, a new piece of equipment or a tool that might be being used, or they certainly need to implement a flexible schedule if that's what the accommodation is. So those are just some quick examples of how managers can be proactive.
Great, thank you. And what can be some of the steps to fast-paced acceptance for reasonable accommodations in the workplace?
I think this really goes back to creating that inclusive workplace culture. We have an inclusive employer handbook, which is a 5-part webinar series addressing a variety of ways that employers can approach this. One way is to have a reasonable accommodation process. Even though that's not mandatory under the ADA, it is certainly a best practice. And then training all your staff that you have that process so they're aware of that. And also using a reasonable accommodation statement in key areas can really send a message that you are an inclusive employer and you want employers or employees to tell you what they need so you can provide accommodations that are needed to help them perform the job. Some other ideas are, again, through your employee resource groups to just address the accessibility barriers that might be present in the work environment, or to host educational sessions on different disability-related topics to start to impact that culture. I think taking those steps really do impact then what's being referred to here as fast pacing the acceptance for accommodations.
Thank you, Julie. We still have a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first one is, how relevant is it to review employees' prior performance in regards to their new request for an accommodation once disclosed? Is their positive performance relevant to downplay or invalidate their request, especially if doctor and specialists outline the disability and support for a requested accommodation?
So reasonable accommodation, or the consideration of it, is what we've always referred to as prospective. So when we talk about performance, the guidance suggests that individuals with disabilities to receive this protection for accommodations are expected to be qualified to perform the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. And that's why everybody is held to the same performance expectations. And so if somebody requests an accommodation during a time of low performance, that's why you can apply consequences, but you also start the interactive process. And so you're always just really thinking of, does the person have a disability that does make them eligible for this process of asking for an accommodation? And then you explore ideas to determine what those effective solutions are. So it's always kind of from a prospective perspective that you approach the process. And with that question, if there's a unique scenario that's going on, we could handle that through more of a consult to maybe suggest some specific strategies or ideas for this unique employer situation, if that would be helpful.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is, how common is it to deny a reasonable request that aligns with Ask Jan and is supported by the doctors, and instead recommended another accommodation that the employee deems ineffective?
I don't know that I can speak to how common it is, but what I can say from the EEOC guidance is that when you're in the interactive process and you're identifying solutions, you may find more than one effective solution. And so the individual may have a preference and the employer may have a variety of options that are effective. So what the guidance says is that the employer should consider the individual's preference, but ultimately the employer is permitted to select the accommodation. The caveat is that the accommodation needs to be effective in enabling the employee to perform the job or access the hiring process or access the workplace.
Great, thank you. Just going through, we had a comment that said, so glad you're emphasizing to ask the employee in addition to getting external expert suggestions as well. Sometimes the simplest things can make the biggest difference. And on the other hand, sometimes an employee might not know or think of things that could be helpful. And then an additional question, once the employee and doctors identify the employer accommodation is ineffective and the employee's requested accommodation is very reasonable, how common is it to utilize a third-party doctor, like an independent medical exam?
I would like to refer to the guidance on this one to just say that in the EEOC guidance, they do address, they give examples of the types of medical professionals that documentation can come from, and that an employer can request that this documentation come from an appropriate type of provider to obtain that. And I think that one, we might need to know a little bit more information about that to give some better guidance, but this is addressed in the EEOC guidance, so we could certainly help connect you with that.
Great, thanks, Julie.
Did we catch them all?
I think so.
Think so. If there's
All
any
right, well,
that are, yeah.
Okay, so we had great participation, great questions. We love that. We're always happy to stick around a little bit longer when that is the case. So thank you again all for joining us today, and know that you can reach out anytime on this topic or anything related to accessibility and accommodations, and the Accessible Ohio team is happy to help. Thank you for joining us today.